Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this informational webinar. We see that folks are still logging in, so we're just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes before we get started. Thanks again. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this informational webinar on the call for community conveners on how learning happens. My name is Monica Kinchlow, and I'm a Senior Director here at America's Promise Alliance. Welcome to the webinar. We did have this webinar yesterday on Tuesday, July 9th, so we're doing it again today on July 10th. And we want to start at the top of this webinar to say that the slides and the recording will be made available on our webpage after this webinar today. So please don't worry, you will have access to this afterwards. We're going to go ahead and get started. All right, today's agenda will cover an overview of America's Promise and a little bit of background on the National Commission and how America's Promise got involved in the post-release work. Then we will discuss the context for this particular funding and convening opportunity and what we aim to accomplish with it. To facilitate the development of effective proposals, we will review the grant's purpose, eligibility criteria, grant-making timeline, key application components, and the application and selection process. Throughout this webinar, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat function. You'll note there's a Q&A function and a chat function through the Zoom software. We ask that you use the chat function to help us streamline our ability to answer your questions. Please also note we have some content we'd like to cover first, and then we will pause at the end of that session to answer questions. But please feel free to enter your questions in the chat function throughout the webinar. America's Promise Alliance is a nationwide coalition of nonprofits, corporations, educators, community and civic leaders, and youth who are joined together around the belief that every young person deserves to succeed and every adult is responsible for making that happen. Through collective leadership and organized campaigns at the community level, America's Promise Alliance members work together toward the 5 promises necessary for every child to thrive: a healthy start, safe places, caring adults, effective education, and opportunities to serve. One of the initiatives we are leading is called How Learning Happens. How Learning Happens is more than a project or an initiative. It is a way of thinking when it comes to young people and the conditions in which they learn, develop, and thrive. We are focused on advancing our collective understanding about how learning happens and helping to fuel a growing movement to educate children as whole people, combining their social, emotional, and cognitive growth, well-being, and success. How Learning Happens describes the body of work, including research and practice, that explains how children and youth grow and develop. In the last few years, brain science and social science research have come together to deepen our understanding that learning is social, emotional, and cognitive. The most powerful learning happens when we pay attention to all three of these aspects, not separately, but woven together, just like how our brains work. Learning settings and youth-serving systems that reflect this understanding have a greater likelihood of achieving key outcomes for young people, including academic achievement, pro-social behavior, employability, and many others. America's Promise Alliance's work to advance this understanding about how learning happens builds on the efforts of many organizations and coalitions that were part of the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. The National Commission released its final report, called A Nation at Hope, back in January to promote a whole child approach to learning and development. Scientific research has proven that learning depends on deep connections across a variety of skills, attitudes, and character traits, which generally fall in three broad categories. 1, skills and competencies. 2, attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets. And 3, character and values. The first area, skills and competencies, which are shown toward the center of this figure, represent approximately a dozen specific behaviors that decades of research and practice indicate are important. Though they are interrelated, they can be organized into 3 areas: cognitive, social, and emotional. These skills and competencies develop and are used in dynamic interaction with 2, attitudes, beliefs, and values, which are shown in the second ring. Attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets include children's and youth's attitudes and beliefs about themselves, others, and their own circumstances. As we will discuss next, there are many ways in which these skills and competencies can show up in young people's lives. Our goal with the call for conveners is to share knowledge and spur action. We want communities to consider how social, emotional, and cognitive skills and competencies show up in the community for young people. Part of the America's Promise effort to bring the content and recommendations from the National Commission to more people is through these community convenings. In creating this convening and funding opportunity, we are seizing upon the growing momentum across the country, but we do so with a great sense of humility about the work that is already happening in the field. On this slide, we share our sense of how social, emotional, and cognitive development work is playing out in communities. In releasing this call for conveners, we are inviting all of you to be part of a national learning agenda where we want to learn much more about how this looks in the field. We know that communities are in different places when it comes to shifting how young people's social, emotional, and cognitive skills are supported in a variety of settings. We also know there is a wide range in practice and that many people are interested in examples of what full or high-quality implementation means and looks like. The Commission's recommendations create a path, and we hope that these convenings can be a way to galvanize support locally. With this context, we wanted to share our priorities in this convening and funding opportunity. As you consider whether to apply and how you might respond to the questions in the application, consider the priorities on the right side of the slide. First and second, applications should reflect an understanding of young people's lived experience and community context. Next, we are guided by the belief that all young people benefit from the How Learning Happens frame, but that some young people will require different or additional supports, and applicants should demonstrate that they understand this and are prepared to act on it. Finally, Because we believe that young people learn and grow in many settings, not only in school, we are looking for communities who will engage in collective action by pulling on stakeholders from multiple sectors. I'll now hand it over to Nivesha, who will discuss the purpose of these convenings.
Thank you, Monica. So first I want to highlight that this call for conveners, America's Promise is seeking 5 community conveners to inspire action on how learning happens, and we will be awarding $30,000 to support planning and execution of the convening. Also, through this call for conveners, we want to identify 5 communities well positioned to achieve 3 overall objectives. First, share knowledge about how learning happens. These convenings are part of a 1-year effort to learn about what is happening in communities to advance young people's social, emotional, and cognitive development. Underpinning this application process is a learning agenda for which we will gather data about where the field is in terms of social, emotional, and cognitive practices. Findings from the learning agenda will inform ongoing work at the national and state level. Second, convening should inspire action and connections across the community by bringing diverse stakeholders together. Bringing diverse stakeholders together is extremely important for this call for conveners because we all know that in order to accelerate progress and to make sure that students are being able to develop socially, emotionally, and cognitively, we have to do this work together. So that bringing diverse stakeholders together is important. And thirdly, convening should result in identification of 2 to 3 opportunities on which the community is poised to act. This objective is extremely important because we want to spur action beyond the convening. Selected communities will be supported by America's Promise, each other, and partner organizations to achieve these objectives. America's Promise Alliance is advancing this understanding about how learning happens and helping to fuel the growing movement to educate children as a whole people, combining their social and emotional well-being with academic growth and success. Our effort builds on the work of many organizations and coalitions to advance a whole child approach to learning and development. We understand that learning looks and feels different in different communities. So we want communities to have the autonomy to own their convening approach. However, each convening should be anchored in community and youth needs. Therefore, the community context should drive community action and fulfill the requirements outlined on this slide. The time limitation on the convening itself is roughly around the 19 to 20 school year because this is part of a 1-year learning agenda. As we have mentioned, representation from multiple sectors is critical. Finally, the needs and opportunity assessment is intended to 1, to document the youth and community needs to underpin the convening approach, and 2, to offer some front-end accountability to inform an after-action plan. Selected communities will be supported in doing the assessment. Who applies is directly connected to who is best positioned to execute the purpose of this convening opportunity within the parameters shared on the earlier slide. Examples of eligible organizations are listed on the slide, but this is not an exhaustive list. At the end of the day, any organization that applies must be able to bring diverse stakeholders together. As applicants, the approach you take to complete your application will differ based on organization, existing work, and pre-existing relationships. Regardless of your plan, successful grant proposals are positioned to do the 4 things on this slide. And so these things are important to keep in mind when you're doing the application process because this is what makes strong applications. We want to first make sure that you're able to describe community in the youth context as the foundational driving forces. So we want to make sure that you're able to describe it so that we can understand how this convening will help the community that you're serving. We also want to describe existing efforts because we want to make sure that you already have a track record of being able to implement this whole child approach and being able to bring these diverse stakeholders together. And then most importantly as well, we want to make sure that you are up to date and know how to explain the practice and policy conditions that promote the young people's comprehensive development in your community. And as we said earlier, every community is different, so these policy conditions and these practices will be also different. So we want you to be able to make sure that you know how to articulate that and show that in your application. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the webinar. With this overview in mind, I am now going to hand it over to my colleague Liz, who will begin to go through each question on the application and briefly describe what we are looking for.
Thank you, Navesha. I wanted to flag really quickly that we're going to go through each question for the next few minutes, and you're welcome to submit questions in the chat box for each one, but we're going to pause at the end of all of our content to answer them, but keep the questions coming. So this application is posted within a form on our host website. So we want to note that the website will not save your responses. We encourage applicants to download the Word version of the application and transfer final responses when you're ready to submit the whole thing through our website. So the application is broken up into 4 main parts. First is applicant information. The second are 5 narrative questions and responses. So each narrative question has a word limit, and this is by design. What we might lose in length, we really hope to gain in responses that are to the point. The third part is a budget and budget narrative, and the final is to check all that apply lists. So the applicant information will be used to notify winners, and will also be how we contact the main point of contact throughout the convening planning process. So multiple organizations can apply together as a community, but the application should be submitted under one organization and lead. The first narrative question is about community context. As applicants, you know more about your communities than we do. The context of the community in which young people live and work, the issues that impact your residents, and the ways that individuals and sectors collaborate to support each other is key to understanding how these convenings can have an impact. With this question, applicants should include details that clearly depict what life is like for young people in their community and how learning is impacted by these details. Information like graduation rates, youth employment rates, and the income makeup of a community may be helpful examples, but responses should connect those pieces to a larger story about what young people are experiencing. Questions 1 and 2 are deeply interconnected. Question 2 is more closely about young people themselves. For this question, applicants should define young people in the way their community defines young people. Age ranges and demographic information will be helpful examples, but may not tell the full story. We are interested in learning about young people's lives and how that impacts the way they interact with their learning environment. Responses could also include details about schools, after-school programs, workplaces, and other community spaces where young people are learning. This section can also further explore initial demographic information from the community context question, but should be focused on the young people who are a part of that context. We want to ensure that these convenings result in action following the event and that there's a community-wide interest in developing a strong culture of action to support young people's social, emotional, and cognitive development. So question 3 is intended to uncover what existing work demonstrates that there are already ongoing community efforts that fall under a How Learning Happens banner, including how those existing efforts support particular groups of students or support action around a particular topic area. Descriptions of these efforts should demonstrate that there are key players in the community leading these efforts who are open to collaboration and partnership and are also open to developing new strategies or forms of support. Note that these existing efforts may be limited in the sense that they are happening in one neighborhood or one set of schools, but are poised to impact more young people and influence more settings. Examples of successes should include who was supported and what success has been achieved. Question 4 differs from question 3. While question 3 is squarely focused on the track record of the whole child work in the community, question 4 is about the track record of you, the convener. Successful convenings occur when a diversity of stakeholders show up for the convening organization. So for this question, we want to know why you, as the applicant, know that your community colleagues will show up for you in this effort. This should include how the convening organization involves or plans to involve young people as central stakeholders. We'd like to also know how your organization has overcome challenges to positively impact young people's lives. Responses should demonstrate how that learning from past community efforts will influence these community convenings. We know that part of community context is the policy landscape for your area. Policies can be different from implemented practices, and we recognize that at the local level, the line between policy and practice is not always clear. We believe that current practice and policy conditions may signal the community's interest and ability to expand the How Learning Happens frame within the community. So with question 5, we want to get a sense of the practice and policy conditions that are already at play. There are a wide range of possibilities here, but for example, an applicant could speak to policies like standards for social and emotional competencies within the school setting. Or another example, there may be a robust employer in the community who provides career exposure opportunities for high school-aged young people. So responses here should be clear about the settings where these practices are occurring or where policies are having an impact. Now I'm going to hand the slides back to Monica to close out the application.
Great, thanks, Liz. So the final piece of the application, or sorry, second to last piece of the application is the budget and the budget narrative. In the budget file, we ask you to provide an estimate for how the $30,000 might be spent. And for the budget narrative, we ask you to share in just a sentence or two how each type of funding will support achieving your goals. Note that submission of the budget Excel file is through a document upload, so it's not within the form itself. You can download the Excel budget template on the web page and then upload it where it says Browse Files within the web form. The budget template has 2 tabs or sheets. Sheet 1 includes the budget detail and space for the brief narrative. Sheet 2 connects to Sheet 1 as an overview or summary of the full budget. You will note that so far, none of the application requires an applicant to specifically state what they would do in a convening, and this is by design. America's Promise Alliance, in partnership with other organizations, will support selected communities in planning and executing each convening. That being said, we included 2 check all that apply lists to see what type of content and perspectives might be prioritized by conveners. The work of How Learning Happens is by its nature integrated and cross-cutting. Yet we recognize that convenings effectively inspire and activate action when they are limited to a few priority topics. We encourage you to use this list to think critically about which topics your community may dive deeply into and how prioritizing those topics might make a positive impact for young people. What expert perspectives, for example, would bring value based on your young people and your community context? We do not expect applicants to check every box in this list. And please note that checking a box at this stage of the application process does not bind the community to that topic in the future if selected. This is the second of the check all that apply lists. We encourage you to consider this list in terms of the content you might lead the convening with. Think about who is on the stage, or who is on a panel, or who is leading a strategy session, or sharing some community perspective. Consider how your stakeholders will be engaged and what their role might be to spur positive change after the convening has concluded. Here we share important dates related to this funding opportunity. All applications must be submitted through the web form, including the budget upload, by 11:59 p.m. on July 24th, 2019. America's Promise will then work to review applications and make decisions to notify selected communities in August of 2019. From there, we are starting the funding period in October, and we recognize that the actual convening will vary over the fall, winter, and spring of the 1920 school year. And so we're saying that summer 2020 is the end of the grant period, keeping in mind that if a convening is earlier, your grant period may end earlier. So before we shift into questions and answers, we wanted to pause and thank the collaborative of funders who are supporting this convening and funding opportunity. The organizations listed on the slide have been longstanding supporters of whole child work, and we are grateful for their support on this call for conveners on How Learning Happens. So at this time, we've concluded the main content of our webinar. We, on purpose, have left lots of time for questions and answers. So we are going to pause now and just put the webinar on mute while we review some of the questions, and we'll rejoin you in just a moment with some answers. All right, we're going to start to answer some of these questions, then we will pause again to review new questions. So we had a question, or a few questions really, that seem to be along the lines of the age of the young people that might be the focus for this type of opportunity. And so we had a question about whether 0 to 8 might be a fair age range, or if there are other ways we're defining this. And I think at the end of the day, this comes back to the responses that you share for questions 1 and 2 about community context and young people's context. America's Promise does not have a specific age range in mind for a given community or convening. But if at the end of the process of evaluating community context and young people's needs, 0 to 8 emerges as an area for collective action, then that would be appropriate. And likewise, you might select young people aged 16 to 24, or high school aged, or middle school and high school age. So we don't have a specific parameter around that. It very much goes to the responses in questions 1 and 2 of the application. We had one question about the possibility of a national organization acting as a convener and how the connection to a community would work. A national organization could certainly be an appropriate convener, but the grain size, so to speak, for this opportunity would have to be a defined community in a state. And so we don't think that this is not ripe for a national type of convening or a national organization who's going to pull from multiple communities. This really is intended to serve a localized community effort. We had a question about whether or not the convening would have to take a cradle to career approach or pick a part or segment within the cradle to career. And I think the answer to that is that community context and young people's needs could certainly inform the selection of a single topic or area on the cradle to career spectrum. So you shouldn't feel like you have to address every aspect of young people's development at every stage, though that would be appropriate if that's what a community chooses to do as well. We had a question about listing all the partners who might be part of a collaborative effort, and we think that the questions about track record may be the most appropriate place to include some of those partners. And what we would say here, we recognize that there are word limits, and again, those are by design. So what we might recommend is sort of including a few of the key partners and stating that there are more, and we totally appreciate that this is a point in time application. So to the extent you get new partners in the future, you may or may not be able to represent that now. We had a question as well about the budget and whether indirect costs can be captured in the budget, and the answer to that is yes. You'll see a line in the budget for administrative overhead, and that for us is the same thing as indirect costs. And there's an FAQ that addresses this, that we accept indirect cost rate or administrative cost rate at 15%. Okay, so we're going to pause again and just revisit some of these questions, and we'll be right back with you. All right, thanks for your patience, everyone. We have a bunch more questions, and we'll probably have 1 or 2 more cycles of this. So we had a question about what the, sorry, let me back up. We had a question about kind of who is best to apply between maybe rural, suburban entities, or a school or a nonprofit entity. And the question is an important one, but it is a strategic question that's based on local context. So I would sort of encourage you to go back to the slides about the role of the convener and what the convener will be asked and expected to do. So, you know, pick a lead organization who applies for this should be able to share a track record of success, a track record of bringing cross-sector partners together. And that may be a school, but perhaps it's a nonprofit who's better positioned to do it, or perhaps a nonprofit has capacity to do so and a school does not. I think those are decisions that are just informed by the local context. We don't have a geographic priority necessarily between rural, suburban, or urban. We do welcome applications from all geographies. There was also a question related to this about collaborative applications, and we do encourage that because I think that demonstrates the cross-sector track record of partnership. And so in terms of that, it's just a matter of picking one of the collaborative organizations to be the lead organization for this opportunity. We had a question about whether the goal at the end is to have action items, and that is correct. We don't want this to just be a meeting for a meeting's sake. This really is intended to be a convening that galvanizes support towards a goal. And so there will be an after action planning component to this. And the grant period does include some of that after action work. We had a question, it seems particularly focused on charter schools, but I do think it could be applicable to any school. And it was about whether or not a school should talk about the students in that school or about the city or community generally. And I think the answer to that is both, because really the goal of this particular convening opportunity is to pull on multiple sectors. And if you're only pulling on context from the education space, there's a risk of missing other context of how young people are being impacted. And so we'd encourage you to sort of work with partners to ensure that you're able to paint that picture of what's happening in the city and who the young people are in an area. Just a quick reminder again that young people are learning in all types of settings, not just in school. And we had a question about whether an organization is already involved in perhaps the Commission's work or CASEL's work or other social and emotional learning efforts, and what would the purpose then of this type of convening be. I think that this effort is very connected to and isn't mutually exclusive from any of those efforts. There's a lot of CASEL work happening in districts and schools, and there's other efforts happening in after school or out of school time programs. The intent of the America's Promise Alliance work is to bring sectors together. So where there may be success or progress happening in one sector, what would it look like for that level of success and commitment to young people and that frame or way of working with young people? What would it take to bring that to other sectors in a community that are also impacting young people? So think about employers, think about job training, think about social services. This is an opportunity for leaders, community leaders across sectors to come together on how learning happens type content so that you're silo busting at the community level. We got a quick question about whether this has to be one convening, and the answer to that is no. We certainly understand that one convening may not be sufficient and often isn't sufficient, so these funds could be part of a convening approach, which involves multiple convenings. We do, because America's Promise is supporting this, we will work with a selected community to understand, is there a culminating type of convening? Is there one large one that can bring leaders across sectors? We do want to see something that kind of brings this all together. We did have a question about whether partners had to be secured in advance for this. And the answer to that is not necessarily, but we do want to remind you that there's an important question here about track record. And so you should probably already have some partnerships established before applying for this. But in terms of whether you have fully signed on partners for the How Learning Happens piece, that may not be the case, and that's okay. That's part of this 1 year of work. There was a question about how America's Promise Alliance will support or collaborate with selected communities. And selected communities will get much more information about this once selected, but we anticipate being there for you every step of the way. We will have an onboarding process at the beginning so that you can understand the scope of experts and resources that are available to you for the convening itself and or convening approach. And we also will be a support through the needs assessment process and the after action planning piece as well. There's also a range of communication supports that we plan to provide to selected communities as well. So we're going to pause again to revisit some of these questions that have been coming in, and we'll be with you in just a moment. All right, so we're going to dive back into some answers. We had a question about letters of support and whether they can be included. Currently, the way the web form is formatted, there's no opportunity to upload letters of support. We have an inbox called howlearninghappens@americaspromise.org. If you have letters of support, you could send them there as an attachment. We had a question about the size and whether we have parameters on the number of people who attend a convening. This is addressed in one of our FAQs in the FAQ document that can be found on the website. And the answer is we don't have a predetermined size or scope of the convenings or convening approach. The parameters are very much anchored in having diverse stakeholder involvement and that cross-sector perspective as well. So for the community, for the context, for the young people, the parameters are that you sort of go beyond just a couple of traditional places where young people are learning and to really go cross-sector. However many people that is the appropriate size for the convening. We had a question about defining community and whether it's a city or a region. And the answer to that is yes, it could be a city, it could be a region. We understand that in many rural parts of America, it may make sense to include a full county or perhaps even 2 counties that work together on things. We also recognize in densely populated cities, a community might actually be a neighborhood. And so we just ask that you define that very clearly in question 1 of the application. We had a question about timing of the convenings themselves, and as we noted in the important date slide, the timing is fixed to be from October of 2019 through summer of 2020, and those dates are fixed. We had a question about allowable uses of funds when it comes to the budget piece. America's Promise is a nonprofit, and we have pretty flexible allowable uses of funds. So for this particular opportunity, we just encourage you to think about what is strategically necessary to carry out your approach to this opportunity. So it might be personnel, it might be event space, it might be food or refreshments for your convening approach, it could be incentives. The allowable uses of funds is quite diverse. We just ask you to be smart about it because, you know, it may raise a flag if you put all of the funding towards personnel. We also just want to note and be really transparent that $30,000 may not be enough to fulfill your vision. And so to the extent that you have existing funds or in-kind support, we encourage you to include a description of that within the budget narrative. We had a question as well about sort of the stemming from the supports that America's Promise will provide, whether the selected communities will be part of a community of practice, and whether or not there's a deliverable or something to share out at the end of this process. And as I said before, there is a suite of resources and interactions that we plan to have with selected communities once selected. I think community of practice is one way of describing what some of those interactions will be, but we do expect for the communities to bring them together virtually so that they can support each other through problems of practice as they tackle this work. And then we do have communication support separate from the $30,000 that will go to communities. We have supports otherwise to capture what's happening in the convenings, what's happening in communities, and there will be a report out of this body of work at the end of the process. I think what we'll do, given that we still have a few more minutes, is just pause one last time and see what remaining questions we have to address. All right, thanks everyone. I think this will be the last round of answers, so thank you for all of your questions. We had a question about grant reporting requirements, and I think at this point in the process, what we can share is that the requirements will include the needs assessment at the front end, holding the actual convening, and there will be a report related to that, and then expenditures reports, and then there will be a set of requirements around the after action plan. We had a question about what we mean exactly by diverse stakeholders and whether that's based on race and ethnicity. And it could mean, it includes by race and ethnicity in terms of diversity, but we're also, again, referring to the cross-sector nature of what we're looking for here. And when you go back in the presentation on slide 9, we describe the convening parameters. And there's a graphic there about the pre-K to 12 education ecosystem that includes lots of players, including the justice system and employers and policymakers. And so when we say diverse stakeholders, we really mean leaders from across those areas that are impacting young people. And so we believe that all of those sectors stand to benefit from the How Learning Happens frame. So the purpose of this convening is really anchored in the idea that you all are in communities that are doing this type of work, that are promoting the social, emotional, and cognitive development of young people. This opportunity is to spread that type of frame and that type of interaction with young people to more sectors, to justice, to the health sector, to social services and employers. And so that's what we initially mean by stakeholders. And we also have a value on diversity by race and ethnicity. We had a couple questions about whether a convening is just a meeting or a conference. And our answer to this is you really need to think more big and bold about this. This is not just a convening to sit and get. This is not a convening or intended to be a meeting where you just do a presentation on social, emotional, and cognitive development. These are intended to bring people together who are in a position of power in the community and can share that power with young people for their benefit and create an action plan that the community, the collaborative, will hold itself accountable for. This is the nature of the opportunity. So if it's just a sit and get conference or a meeting, that's not the best fit for this. We really encourage everyone to think big and think bold for this. We had a question about allowable uses of funds and whether an app that includes questions and such, perhaps a survey, whether that type of app could be a allowable use of funds, and to the extent that that supports your convening approach, that could be an allowable use of funds. And then I think this might be the last question we end on. We had a question about whether we could point you to any previous awardees or examples of previous convenings. And the answer to this question is no. This call for conveners on how learning happens is the first of its kind that we know of. And so we don't have any type of gold standard. This is new work that you and we are charting together. And so the best model we have for cross-sector types of convenings like this at America's Promise is our Grad Nation Summits, which were done over a period of almost 10 years, and over 200 of them were done. But I think something we are trying to do quite differently from that is to ensure that there's a robust support system before, during, and after the convening so that we can really spur action locally and build that collaborative capacity muscle within communities to do something with the convening. And so you don't just leave inspired, but rather inspired and acting. So that's where we're coming from with this. We're really excited to see all of your applications, and we thank you very much for joining our webinar today. On this last slide here, you'll see where you can get more information. I mentioned before we have an inbox here at America's Promise called How Learning Happens at americaspromise.org, and we are staffing that right now through the application period. If you send us a question, we will do our best to get you an answer in no more than 2 days. You can find all materials related to this opportunity at the webpage on the screen, and that includes a downloadable application and budget template. It includes the FAQ document, which will be updated by the end of this week with a lot of the questions that were on this webinar and yesterday's webinar. And that webpage also includes the application web form for final submission. And then finally, this week as well, this webpage will include these slides of the webinar today and the recording from yesterday and today. Thanks everyone for joining us. We look forward to reading your applications and hearing from all of you. Thanks for all you do. Goodbye.